We're talking about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, on the inside we have the adrenal medulla, of course. On the inside we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, and on the outside, the cortex of the adrenal gland, we have the corticosteroids, the adrenocorticosteroids. There are several different groups of steroids, several different types of steroids. Mineralocorticoids affect the ion concentration of the sodium in the kidneys. So the mineralocorticoids regulate the salt content or the sodium content in your body. The adrenal cortex also produces sex steroids. The chief sex steroid by the adrenal cortex is androstenedione. This is a steroid that Mark McGuire was using. They found it in his locker. There was a reporter, and he was filming McGuire, and he opened his locker, and there was androstenedione. And he was taking it. Wasn't illegal at the time, of course. Steroids weren't illegal in the major leagues, but of course here's Mark McGuire, as big as a truck, and he's just crushing home runs into the upper decks, and there you go. One of the interesting things about androstenedione, it contributes to adult hair growth patterns in men and women. Some women have male hair growth patterns. Male hair growth patterns tend to, men go bald. Not all of them, of course. But even if they don't go bald, sometimes they have hair losses right here, or around the peaks of their hair, or on the very top of their hair. So we see that hair growth pattern in women. But of course, that's not really what you're looking at. With women, the pubic hair grows in a masculine hair growth pattern, as odd as that may seem. So what does that mean? Well, men have more hair than women do, and sometimes you will see a woman with masculine hair growth pattern. Their pubic hair will grow all the way up to their navel. That's, a lot of men have that hair growth pattern as well. What else do we see? Some men are attracted to women who have a high testosterone level. It can potentially indicate that they have a strong sex drive. So some men are attracted to women who are maintain some of these obvious testosterone cues. One of them is a deeper voice. So men are attracted to a deeper voice. It's an alto voice. So, people like Anne Murray, who has a relatively deep voice, and they're attracted to their deep voice. Who's another singer? Oh, Cher. Cher's an alto. Sometimes Cher will sing with a male with a baritone. Yeah. Who has a higher voice than she does? Peter Cetera is an example that I'm thinking of. If you watch movies sometimes, and you may not even think about this, but if the lady is attracted to the man, a lot of times her voice will get deeper. There was a movie made in 1932. It happened one night. Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable. And at one point, she's talking to him in this little chirpy little girl voice, and then all of a sudden she's laying down in the straw. That they're bedding down for the night. He's bedding down over here, and she's bedding down over here, and so she's been chirping at him all day long, and all of a sudden she says, "What are you thinking?" And if you don't think about it, you don't realize that she's trying to seduce him. She doesn't, of course, but that's not important. There are other indicators of a high testosterone level. One of them has to do with a gap between the two front teeth. They've been talking about gap-toothed women for a long time. Chaucer talked about a gap-toothed woman, and that's an indication of a high testosterone level. So a lot of men are looking for high testosterone levels because they're looking for a stronger sex drive. A more obvious libido in this. It's kind of interesting, and most people don't even care. But it's just one of those indicators. It's just one of those things you recognize, you understand. Facial hair, if a woman has any degree of facial hair, it can mean that they have a high testosterone. That's one of the indicators that people try to hide. The rest of them you can't hide. I mean, you can't. Well, you can. You can get braces on your teeth so that your gap goes away. Anyway, so you can look at pubic hair growth patterns. You can look at the hair on top of their head potentially and see if they have really bushy eyebrows. That's an indicator as well. There's just lots and lots of ways. And all of it has to do with excess testosterone. The adrenal cortical hormones are controlled by ACTH released from the pituitary gland. Stress is detected by the hypothalamus, and it releases the corticotropin releasing hormone, which induces the pituitary, of course, to release the ACTH. Unfortunately, of course, the glucocorticoids released because of the ACTH, when released in high levels, can kill nerve cells in the hippocampus, which means the more stress that you're under, the worse your memory is going to be. The reality is that stress is supposed to induce you to remember things so that you can survive in case of an attack. But if there is just too much stress, then some of your memory goes away. Now, maybe that's a good thing if you think about it. So if you've got somebody that has been in combat for an extended length of time, it's probably a godsend for them to forget some things. So this is possibly a defense mechanism that the body uses to keep from getting PTSD. The thyroid gland is located around the esophagus, just below your voice box. If you're a male, you can feel it. You can feel your voice box. Males have a prominent voice box. So right below that is your thyroid gland. So it's just right above your collar. It's right here. It's not as easy to find for women, but of course it's very simple for males because they've got that prominent voice box. Anyway, that's where it is. And here's your voice box right here. And then your thyroid gland. It looks like a butterfly. There are 3 hormones are secreted by the thyroid. Those 3 hormones are calcitonin, and then the 2 thyroid, the thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T3 and T4, what we refer to as T3 and T4 are the 3. Calcitonin, T3 and T4 actually have to do with the thyroid, have to do with metabolism. Calcitonin has to do with calcium, and that's its job. It regulates calcium in your body. The hormones are stored in the thyroid colloid, which is really kind of interesting. Most hormones, of course, you have just a select amount. They don't really last very long. You need to continue to reproduce these. However, the thyroid hormones, you've got about 100 days worth of thyroid hormones in your thyroid colloid. So even if you have problems with your thyroid, you get cancer, or it just stops functioning, you're not going to realize it for about 100 days. And probably a little bit longer than that, because it will kind of just drag along, and you really won't have any symptoms for a while. Calcitonin, of course, promotes calcium use in the bones. T3 and T4 levels are regulated by the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland, from the anterior pituitary. T3 and T4 are what make you hypo or hyperthyroid, along with the TSH. Now there can be a problem, and the problem is not yet. T3 and T4 are amines, but they act as steroids, passing through the cell membrane, finding a receptor cell, and then binding to the DNA. So it's a relatively slow process, T3 and T4. And that's okay, because this has to do with metabolism. Most of your metabolism takes place while you are asleep. About 80% of your cell maintenance takes place when you're asleep. Now the problem is, if you're all juiced up on methamphetamines like Hope, or caffeine, whichever the case may be. The problem is that you didn't repair your body last night. You only got 2 or 3 hours of sleep. And potentially, and the reality is that when you go to sleep, you go through your sleep cycles. The first sleep cycle is the deepest. And it's during that deep sleep when you repair things. So potentially you did anyway, despite the fact you only got a couple hours of sleep. You can take a nap and potentially you are going through that delta 4 wave sleep, and that's when all of your repairing is taking place. That's when most of your metabolism is taking place. So if somebody wakes you up from a deep sleep after 2 or 3 hours, you probably have already repaired yourself. You're good to go. The human body does that because of the probability that they might get awakened, but we need to maintain ourselves. So that metabolism takes place at the very beginning of the sleep cycle, just to make sure that you get it in. T3 and T4 are released from the thyroid gland because of the influence of TSH, and we already talked about that. It's secreted by the TSH is secreted by the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary, and then it is harassed by the hypothalamus to release the TSH by thyroid-tropin releasing hormone. Okay, so we need our thyroid gland to function properly. If it doesn't function properly, we got some problems. The thyroid gland is critically dependent on iodine. So where do you get iodine? Salt. Well, we get it from salt, but that's because we put it in salt. Yeah, we get it from salt, but where does iodine come from naturally? Seafood. It comes from seafood. So it comes from ocean fish. It comes from shellfish in the ocean. That's where we get it. So what if you live inland? You guys live in. You guys have always lived in. Where did you get your iodine? Probably from the salt you were eating, I'm guessing. Yeah, it's probably brown salt. If you read accounts of post-Columbian natives, a lot of times they built their villages around salt licks, and the salt licks, of course, came from when this was ocean. Okay, so the iodine, or the salt, had iodine in it. A lot of times the salt wasn't white. It was rarely white, actually. It was usually brown. And the reason it was brown is because it had iodine in it. So if you look at the tribes that were in Indiana or Illinois, they always built their villages around salt licks. And those salt licks were not white salt, it was brown salt. So the inland tribes, even the inland tribes, of course the problem was that if you couldn't find a salt lick in a place close, you couldn't live there. You had to get your salt from somewhere. I mean, everybody needs salt. So that was a problem. That could potentially be a problem. And that may be one of the reasons why, if you look at where people were pre-Columbian, before Columbus, before the European incursion, then what we see people close to rivers, low areas, but we see large empty areas around the United States, potentially lots of empty areas where grass grew. So they were good hunting areas, but people didn't live out there on the Great Plains. It's one of the reasons why the Great Plains were the Great Plains. They needed the salt. So that may be one of the answers to a question that nobody's asked yet. They needed the salt, and everybody needs the salt. The reality may be that humans aren't meant to live. Humans are meant to live close to the ocean. That may be the reality. 75% of the people in the United States live within 100 miles of the ocean, of a large body of water. Now this doesn't include freshwater. If you've got a freshwater fish, it's not going to do you any good. They don't have iodine. You need the salt. And the reason that they have iodine in their system is so that they can live in that salty environment. Now, one of the interesting things about iodized salt, that's what Francis was talking about. One of the interesting things about iodized salt, it's saltier than sea salt, as odd as that may seem. And I've complained about this to my wife, and she thinks I'm nuts, because salt is salt as far as she's concerned, but I find iodized salt a lot saltier, but it's got that bitter taste too, and I think that's probably what I'm after. But I'm from Indiana, and Indiana has a really serious problem with salt. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. An inadequate supply of iodine will lead to hypothyroidism. Since the thyroid output is inadequate, the pituitary produces more and more TSH to compensate, but only succeeds in enlarging the thyroid in a condition known as goiter. So inland we have a lot of people with goiter. That's a real serious problem. In the United States, this is combated with iodized salt, and it was Morton that first started putting iodine in their salt. And when they first started putting iodine in their salt, people didn't like it because it was too salty. So they were using less of it, and it was bitter. It's got a bitter flavor to it. But of course, I grew up with iodized salt because I'm from Indiana. And in Indiana, we have no seafood. And of course, this was in the 1950s, 1960s, transporting seafood, and I don't eat fish anyway, but transporting seafood all the way to Indiana is something that people usually don't do. You can get seafood up in Chicago because it comes down the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes and into Chicago, but not in most of Indiana. Most farmers in Indiana don't eat seafood. Until 1924, goiter was endemic in areas of the United States where iodine from seafood was not prevalent. In Michigan, in a study in 1923, showed a 39% prevalence rate among school children, 39%, more than 1 out of every 3. In Ohio, it was about the same amount, 31% of school children were estimated with goiter. In West Virginia, goiter was rare as long as they used the local brown salt, which had iodine in it, of course. When pure white salt was replaced with the brown salt in 1922, a 1922 study showed that 61% of the school children had enlarged thyroid glands. So we have all of these areas that are inland. This is good farm country, and one of the reasons it's good farm country is because there's no salt in the soil. So it grows, and the soil is nice and black. Why is it black? Because it grows in lots of really good vegetation. And it's because there's no salt in the soil. If you wander around Indiana or Illinois or Ohio, wherever you are, if you wander around and you look at the plowed fields, the disc fields, what you'll find is there are certain areas that won't grow corn. It won't grow wheat. It doesn't grow soybeans. And what you're usually seeing is the top of a hill, and the soil down below will be nice and brown, all the way to black, all the way to the bottom of the low area. But on top, it's this. You can even see the salt. It's whitish. That's where I lived on top of a hill, and our grass wasn't very thick. We couldn't grow corn. We owned a farm, but we couldn't grow corn in certain portions of our farm because of the salt, and you could see it. You could see that the ground was a much lighter hue, and you could actually see the salt. You could actually see that it was white. I live in Iowa now, and as I'm driving to the interstate, I go past a field, and there's corn growing all over the place except right here on top of the hill. And it's just the oddest thing in the world. It starts to grow, the corn starts to grow, then it dies. They always plant it, but it never grows. And it's because of the salt. Okay, good stuff. Salt. Okay, so we know what happens if you don't have any salt. Not a good thing. So you need to eat use iodized salt unless you eat a lot of seafood, and then you don't need iodized salt. It's really hard to find non-iodized salt. I guess it's not so hard for you guys. I think you guys use iodized salt over at the cafeteria.
Yeah, there's several different salts. We use sea salt, kosher salt.
Oh, is that right?
Iodine salt. 3 or 4 types of salt.
Kosher salt. That's interesting. Why is the kosher salt kosher? I think it's been blessed. I think that's why.
There was one of the kids were telling me about it. They've actually cooked for a group that don't eat meat or pork. Or some they use
Shellfish. Jewish people don't eat shellfish.
Yeah. And they would use the kosher salt. Yeah, but like you said, it was like blessed salt.
Yeah, it's blessed. That's all it is. Makes it kosher. The guys that make hot dogs, who are those guys that make kosher hot dogs? I can't think of who they are, but they have a rabbi that works there, and that's his job is to bless the hot dogs. They're all beef hot dogs, of course. Jewish people don't eat pork, but it's really kind of interesting. As a fetus is developing, if the thyroid hormones are not high enough, they will cause stunted growth, facial malformations, and a reduction in brain size. Because of the reduction in brain size, the child will suffer from intellectual deficits. This is known as cretinism, when they are hypothyroid. One of the things that we do when a baby is born, first of all, we look for PKU. We look for phenylketonuria to find out if they are phenylketonuric. The other thing that we do is we check the thyroid. We check their thyroid function. We check their T3 and T4. Actually, we just check their T4. If their T4 is too low, we fear that they are hypothyroid. It used to be worse than it is today. And the reason it's not so bad anymore is because women are using iodized salt. So we don't see this very much anymore. In the old days, well, this was actually before I started in medicine, in my mother's days, back in the 1930s and 1940s. We used to see it all. They used to see it all the time, but we didn't see it hardly at all. And the reason is because they started using iodized salt. So the level of cretinism actually went down. Okay, let's talk about the gonads. The male gonads are the testes, and they're located in a sac beneath the penis. Each testis produces millions of sperm a day through Sertoli cells. So sperm are produced by Sertoli cells. S and S, Sertoli and sperm. Okay, there you go. So the Sertoli cells produce the sperm. Right beside the Sertoli cells are cells called the Leydig cells, and these cells secrete testosterone. And that's the reason that males have a high testosterone level, because of the Leydig cells. So you have 2 gonad cells that produce testosterone and sperm. Now the amazing thing about the Sertoli cells is that they produce so many. In the old days, it was estimated that they can produce as many as 30,000 per second. Remember, you got tons of these guys in your testes. So you're producing lots and lots of sperm. Of course, now that the sperm counts are going down, we're not exactly sure what the hell is going on. But the Sertoli cells are the ones that produce the sperm. Testosterone and other androgens are regulated by luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone is controlled by the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So once again, the hypothalamus controls your sexuality by releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which releases LH, luteinizing hormone, which induces the Sertoli cells to produce sperm and the Leydig cells to produce testosterone. And that's how boys work. So let's talk about females. The female gonads are the ovaries, of course. They are located above the vagina at the very bottom of the abdominal cavity. There are 2 ovaries, one on each side of the uterus. The ovaries produce progestins, and estrogens. Remember, the testes produce androgens, but the ovaries produce both progestins and estrogens. Now, the reality is that males have progestin and estrogen as well. They don't have as high an amount as the female does. The most important estrogen is estradiol. The primary progestin is progesterone. Estrogens trigger the production of progestin receptors in the brain. Hence, with puberty, progestin sensitivity ushers in the menstrual cycle after estrogen is secreted from the ovaries. And that's what causes menarche. That's what makes a female able to reproduce. The progestins, estrogen and progesterone. All three sex hormones, androgens, estrogens, and progestins, have a similar chemical structure. They are four interconnected carbon rings. The sex hormones, along with the adrenal corticoid steroids, are derived from cholesterol. So if you take too much of the somatostatin, and you know that may have something to do with a lowered sperm count. The fact that everybody's trying to lower their cholesterol. So if we eat a lot of fat, then we have a higher sperm count, but then we die young. Wait a minute, let me see if this figures out. Anyway, okay, so yeah, that's kind of a problem, isn't it? So it's all made from cholesterol. So if you lower your cholesterol too much, potentially you're not going to have enough cholesterol to produce your sex hormones, the four carbon rings. Estrogens are synthesized from androgens, and androgens are synthesized from progestins. So we start out with progestins, and then we create androgens, and then the androgens produce the estrogens. Both males and females have the same sex hormones, of course, only in different proportions. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about the male brain and testosterone. They bathes the male brain, and it changes the structure of the brain. It makes it more hardwired for some reason. And we're not exactly sure why. Okay, so that's the way it works. Sertoli cells, sperm, Leydig cells, testosterone. So you can ask yourself, who has the more complex reproductive organs, the male or the female? Picture the male. Who has the most complex reproductive organs? The male does, actually, because they have all of these organs inside their reproductive area that produce an alkaline ejaculate. And the reason it has to be alkaline is so that it can neutralize the acidic female reproductive system. It needs to neutralize it. If one of those organs doesn't work, the prostate, and there's a number of others that add to the alkalinity. If one of those organs doesn't work, then his semen isn't alkaline enough to neutralize the acidic female area. The reason the female has an acidic reproductive area is to protect it from bacteria, because the more acidic it is, the less, the harder it is for bacteria to live in that area. So the female reproductive system is very acidic. So the male has to neutralize that acidity, and that's why his semen is so alkaline. Does all that make sense? Okay. And if one of those organs doesn't work, then he can't reproduce. So while I was in the service, and we were trying to figure out why this guy couldn't impregnate anybody, or that guy couldn't impregnate anybody, all of these, we had to look at all these things. One of the things you had to measure was the alkalinity, was whether it was the semen was alkaline enough or not. And that was one of the aspects. We had one guy that came in, and he actually wasn't married, but he thought it was odd that he couldn't impregnate his girlfriend. Don't ask any questions. It was kind of weird. Anyway, so this guy kept giving us semen specimens. And we had to check it for his alkalinity. And what they determined was that he had a buccal plug. He had he had a plug in one of his tubules, and it was blocking one of his organs. And so he wasn't producing an alkaline enough semen, and that's why he couldn't impregnate him. He was producing sperm, he was producing semen, but it wasn't alkaline enough. And I won't tell you what they told him to do, but anyway, he needed to get that buccal plug out of there. And it took him months to get the buccal plug out of there. And he'd come in once a week and give us a semen specimen. We had to dip it to find out how alkaline it was. As curious as all that is. Anyway, sorry to talk about medicine so much. You know, but it's one of the things. I mean, was it her fault? Was it his fault? This wasn't his first girlfriend. His first girlfriend left him because he couldn't get her pregnant. She wanted to get pregnant, and he couldn't do it. I had a girlfriend that wanted me to impregnate her, and I couldn't do it either because she had a problem. It wasn't me. I already had 2 kids, but she couldn't get pregnant. And eventually, of course, I married her and we figured out what the problem was. And then, of course, she left me by that time. Anyway, not important. Are all these things important? Yeah, I guess they are. I mean, if you want a baby, you want a baby, and there's not a whole lot you can do if your organs aren't working correctly. There are things you can do to yourself to really mess yourself up. One of them is smoke pot. You know, pot is not good for reproduction at all. It creates too many abnormal forms. It changes the alkalinity of your semen. So there's, you know, that's we're having problems reproducing now. If they legalize marijuana, there may never be any more babies in the United States. Unlike most brain structures which are paired, there's only one pineal gland. The hypothalamus, of course, there's a pair of them. The thalamus, there's one on each side of your brain. Almost everything is paired in your brain, except for the pineal gland. It lays on top of your brain stem. It's right behind your eyes. The pineal gland produces the amine hormone melatonin. Melatonin receptors are metabotropic, thus they activate G proteins. And because of that, they act really, really slow. It takes you all day to build up enough melatonin and to get your melatonin working. Since melatonin activates metabotropic receptors, reaction is very slow. It regulates the circadian rhythm and the reaction to light and dark. The more light you see, the more melatonin is produced. As soon as it turns dark, guess what happens next? You go to sleep. It puts you to sleep. Melatonin can be used to move the sleep cycle up in the night, but because it has a metabotropic receptor, it only works over time, and this is one of the problems. So in the old days, they used to tell you that if you took melatonin, then you would live longer. That was the idea. But of course, that never panned out. The other thing is they told you to take melatonin if you had jet lag. Because if you fly from Los Angeles to New York, you're 3 hours behind. No, you're 3 hours ahead. You're 3 hours ahead. So your brain is on Los Angeles time, and it thinks it's 6 o'clock at night, and people in New York, it's 9 o'clock in New York. But your brain thinks it's 6 o'clock. This has happened to me over and over again. It's tough to fly. We flew to Japan. When I flew to Japan, I flew to Korea. Geez, what a mess. I had no idea what time it was because I went over the international date line. So it was a day, I lost a day. Or no, I gained a day. No, I lost a day. That's right, I lost a day. And when I flew to Vietnam, boy, that was miserable. They used to give you a week to recover from that. They didn't send you out in the field for it. They didn't start training you until you'd been there for a week, because your brain was still in the States. And you needed to get it regulated to whatever it was there. I mean, it could have been dangerous. I mean, they send you out on patrol at night, and your brain still thinks it's, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, that's not going to work. Anyway. Okay, yeah, it was tough. It was tough. The pancreas serves 2 main functions. It produces digestive enzymes, and as an endocrine gland, it secretes insulin and glucagon. This is your pancreas. The endocrine gland portion of the pancreas is a series of specialized cells called islets of Langerhans. So you've got these islets of Langerhans in your pancreas, but all around it are digestive juices. The pancreas is producing all of these digestive juices. So potentially, if you have a problem, if you have an abscess in your pancreas, if you have a sore spot in your pancreas from drinking too much alcohol, which can happen, it can eat the pancreatic tissue. It can also eat the islets of Langerhans, your insulin-producing portions of your pancreas. Once upon a time, pancreatic abscesses were a death sentence. If you had a pancreatic abscess, there was no way to stop it, because you're dealing with tissue that is producing battery acid, in essence. It's producing acid, so it would just eat itself up, and there was nothing they could do to arrest it. We sent a guy he was a drinker, and we sent him down to San Antonio. I was stationed in Texas, Lubbock, Texas at the time, and we sent him down to San Antonio. We figured we'd never see the guy again. I mean, usually if somebody had a pancreatic abscess, you might as well forget it. He's got a couple months and he's a goner. This guy wasn't very old either. He was just in his middle 30s. But he started running, and it reversed the whole process. I know. He had this huge hole where his pancreas used to be. He had enough islets of Langerhans to function. He went on a special diet, started running. This guy was nuts. He had this god-awful hole in his gut. It was nasty. I mean, it was like this. It was like this deep. It was, and he'd go out to run, and this is in Lubbock, Texas. It's hot in the summertime. He just stripped down to his running shorts, and he's got this ugly, god-awful gash in his gut. It was nasty. Anyway, but that's how he stayed alive, and he became a ultra marathoner. He could run forever, and evidently, I mean, ultra marathoners run like 24 hours. See how far they can go. They're nuts. Both glucagon and insulin affect the glucose utilization by the body's cells. The peptide hormone insulin is produced in beta cells within the islets of Langerhans, while the glucagon is produced in alpha cells of the islets. So you have the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans, but around it you've got the alpha cells. And the alpha cells produce glucagon, and the beta cells produce insulin. Now this is weird, because glucagon and insulin are the very opposite. You produce insulin when you have a high sugar level in your blood, and it's the insulin that breaks down the insulin, or breaks down the sugar. If you have too much, or if you don't have enough sugar in your blood, then glucagon is produced, and the glucagon will induce the liver to release glycogen, and glycogen breaks down into sugar. Now we've got enough energy to do whatever we need to do. So if you just ate a big meal, like your fruit, which has fructose in it, which is a simple sugar, a monosaccharide, then your body is right now, it's producing insulin so it can break down that sugar, and it can utilize it as energy. However, Francis is sitting here and he hasn't eaten anything for 8 hours. So he needs to, well, he has, but I mean, if he hadn't eaten anything for 8 hours, he's sitting here and he needs energy because I'm getting him all excited and he needs to write all those notes. So he produces glucagon, and the glucagon induces his liver to release glycogen, and the glycogen breaks down into sugar, and now you've got enough energy to pick up your pen and write all that stuff. All right, there you go.
There's I think I mentioned a while back where a relative was sleepwalking. I don't know if you remember that, but he was sleepwalking in this and he went to get it checked just recently. And I guess do the blood work and getting checked over this and found out he was type 2 diabetes.
Is that right?
His whole lifestyle changed now. This last night we were talking with him and he started exercising. His diet is totally changed. No more drinking.
Oh, he was a drinker.
Yeah. Well, he just recently started, like, he's young. He's like probably 25.
He's 25 and he developed type 2 diabetes. Oh my God.
Yeah.
How does
So
that happen? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know. When he left from here, he's pretty much. I would say he was pretty much already set. It was already like that.
Right.
So when he went to the city, that's when it was really. He had all these problems with his health stuff.
And it just got worse because he moved to the city.
Is it because of the alcohol that he was drinking?
Probably, yeah.
Plus the, when you live in the city, you eat out a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Not enough exercise.
Not enough
Exactly.
exercise too.
That's probably one of the what put it into overdrive too is
Right.
the eating.
He's not getting enough sleep. Not repairing his body enough. It's noisy in the city
Yeah.
all the time.
Sirens going all the time.
Sure. And people want to do things. They think because there's so much light. I mean, if you live out in the middle of nowhere,
You can't go to movie theater.
well, when you turn off the lights at night, it's dark. But if you turn off your lights in the city, it's still bright. I mean, you've got all kinds of lights all over the place. So you get sleep deprived, and you don't even recognize it because you're trying to adapt to the new lifestyle, and you don't even recognize the light. We have the same problem up north. They've got street lights all over the reservation. It was the weirdest thing in the world. There's nobody for hundreds of miles. Then all of a sudden you see the reservation, and it's like it's like lights exploding from the ground or something. It's just
Las Vegas.
and they were having problems with sleep deprivation, even though they lived out in the middle of nowhere. Where I lived, I just turned out the lights, and when I didn't have a security light. A lot of farms have security lights, but I don't like them. I can see better in the dark than I can with the shadows from the security light Anyway, yeah, that can be a serious problem. I'm 25. See, in the old days, when we first started noticing type 2 diabetes, it was usually in somebody in their 40s or 50s. They were developing type 2 diabetes because they stopped, they had a more sedentary lifestyle. All of a sudden, because when people retire, they figure they don't have to do jack squat anymore, except watch television. So they were sitting there getting fat, and since they were sitting down, they were putting fat around their gut. And that's what causes type 2 diabetes. But here, this kid's 25 years old, and he's developed type 2 diabetes. Is he fat?
He's tall.
He's
I could say
fat.
tall and big.
Tall and big.
Yeah. It's just like that.
That's pear-shaped. I'm sorry. That's pear-shaped. That's fat. Okay. Yeah, that's his problem. 25 years old, he develops type 2 diabetes. See, we used to never see that at all, ever. And here, all of a sudden, there's a kid that walks around.
Yeah, I see him.
But he's just round, and he's not very old.
He actually, I think he actually lost a couple of them because the clothes that he used to wear is shrinking,
Oh.
and he's moving a little bit faster because when I was seeing him at one spot, and I kind of come back around to like further ahead of the
Yeah.
So I gave him a high five, walk by, but good job.
It's going to develop type 2 diabetes. Okay. This is a good idea. This is a great idea. He's going to have type 2 diabetes before he's 21 years old. I mean, it's just the way it is. You can't do that. I mean, that's just not, the human body's not supposed to look like that. Yeah. He just was too sedentary for too long while he was growing up.
It's a habit, eating habits.
Yeah, well, potentially, he didn't eat that badly, but there was just too much sugar in it, like cereal,
Starch like
Yeah,
like flour,
sure,
potatoes.
exactly. So he's drinking the milk, which has sugar in it, has maltose in it. He's eating the cereal, which has sugar in it. Even if you eat Cheerios, it still has sugar in it. There's just, it's a tragic situation. But I'll bet you that he was eating sugary cereal at the same time. And he may have been eating it for every meal, but that's milk which has sugar in it, that's the cereal that has sugar in it. So even though theoretically it should have been, could potentially have been healthy, because he was eating too much of it, he gained too much weight. Anyway. When glucose rises to a select point, insulin is released into the bloodstream. The insulin induces the cells to, I know I've already talked about all this stuff. Okay, glucagon serves the opposite purpose of insulin. Glucagon is produced when you don't have enough sugar in your system. Insulin is produced when you have in your blood, and insulin is produced when you have too much sugar in or you have an adequate amount of sugar in your blood. So it allows you to break down the sugar and turn it into energy. When the pancreas detects a low blood sugar level, glucagon is released, and then it induces the liver to release the glycogen. I've already talked about that. There's a paracrine action between the alpha and the beta cells, the islets of Langerhans. So if you can't produce both of them at the same time. You can't produce glucagon at the same time you produce insulin. So if you're producing insulin, it induces the alpha cells to not produce glucagon. It tells them not to produce the glucagon. So they intercommunicate. And it's this communication that allows you to break down sugar properly. And if this breaks down, all of a sudden you've got type 2 diabetes. That ain't good. Oh, that's the end of the chapter. Okay, well that's exciting.
Question on the thyroid. So
Right.
thyroid, how does thyroid, I know people who have
Hypo?
hypo, are they more, they're not energetic?
No, not at all.
And then.
Because that controls your metabolism.
Yeah.
That's what you see people with high metabolism rates, they're skinny as minutes. I mean, they're just really skinny people because they're moving all the time. It's like they're on speed. So that's hypothyroid.
And then.
Hypo is where they don't have enough energy. So one of the things that we do if we find somebody that's overweight and they come in and they complain about their weight, one of the things we'll do is we'll check their thyroid to find out if they're hypothyroid. Because potentially what we can do, we can give them TSH, probably TSH, yeah, we'll give them TSH. And that will induce the T3 and T4 it'll produce more T3 and T4, and that will allow them, that'll give them more energy. And since they have more energy, they're less sedentary. The problem is theoretically this is the way it should work. If I give you more T3 and T4, it's going to make you more active. But the reality may be that nobody has an active lifestyle anymore. Just because you feel like doing something doesn't mean you're going to do it. That's the problem. So if they're hypothyroid and they have adopted the lifestyle of a sedentary person, not like your relative, but if they've adopted that lifestyle, it's hard to get them to get off their ass and move. I mean, it's tough. And this is a problem. And it's not just a problem here on the reservation, but it's a problem all over the United States. We got some this is probably the laziest country in the whole wide world. I mean, you've got people that will jump in their car to go a quarter of a mile down the road instead of walk to the store. Yeah, they'll get in the car and drive. And they've got all kinds of excuses. Oh, it's too dangerous for them. But places, but they don't have the same problem in Europe because the lifestyle is different. For one thing, gasoline is really expensive over there. It's like 4 times as expensive as here. Yeah. So for that reason, people don't want to drive just down the street. They will walk. So their lifestyle is a lot more active than people in the United States. So the hypothyroid has to do with no energy. It has to do with weight gain. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll check your thyroid to find out if you're hypothyroid. If you are, then we will give you T3 and T4 and try to put you on an exercise program to increase the metabolism. Because it doesn't do any good to give you T3 and T4 if you're so lazy you won't get off your block. If you're a couch potato, if you're stuck to the couch and can't get up, then your metabolism is going to stay the same, despite the fact that we've just tried to increase it. I can't give you a pill that will just make the weight go away. I mean, even if your problem is your thyroid, your metabolism. And how long is it going to take your metabolism to kick in? Well, remember, you've got 100 days of stuff in your system. The problem with dealing with somebody that's hyperthyroid is they've already got an excess amount of T3 and T4, and there's nothing we can do about those first 100 days. These people are really, really slender. They look like they're on speed. They act like they're on speed. They're only sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night. Yeah, so one of the things... He's hyperthyroid, so he's really skinny. Really skinny. I've got no body fat at all. When somebody develops type 1 or type 2 diabetes, well, type 2 diabetes, usually they're already fat. But if somebody's got type 1 diabetes or develops type 1 diabetes as an adult, what will happen is, since they can't utilize sugar in their system, they don't accumulate any fat at all, so they start losing fat. So they get skinny, people that develop type 1 diabetes. They get really skinny because their bodies can't utilize sugar anymore. So they don't have any body fat at all. The other thing is that they have, they'll start putting off what we what are called ketones. And ketones stink. They really smell bad. So if you go on a diet, let's say you go on a diet for one reason or another. My wife does this from time to time. She'll go on a diet and she'll start losing fat. But when you burn fat in your system, then you also burn ketones. And ketones have an odor, and you can smell it in the breath. So her breath stinks when she's on a diet because she's burning fat and putting off ketones. This is ugly stuff, isn't it? I know. And the smell is something you'll never forget if you ever smell it. It's bad. It's really, really bad.
It's probably all the bad stuff that's coming out, all the bad stuff that is probably coming out, even through the pores.
Yeah, you have toxins in your system, and it's one of the reasons why you need to, whoops, what did I do? It's one of the reasons that you need to exercise. You've got lots of toxins in your system, and you need to sweat. And the sweat gets rid of those toxins. If you haven't exercised in 2 or 3 weeks, and then you exercise, that night that you exercise, especially if you exercise a lot, you're going to just be dead. And you're going to feel almost nauseous. And the reason is because you've released all those toxins, and now your body has to get rid of those toxins. So the best idea is to just have a regular exercise program where you sweat. you get rid of all those toxins. Of course, there are various exercises you can do that release more toxins. If you're a weightlifter, if you lift weights, the first time you lift weights, you get sore. But one of the reasons is because you're releasing all those toxins that you have accumulated over whatever the last time was that you lifted. So you put off a lot of toxins. I do this all the time. I'll just not exercise for a while, and then all of a sudden I'll exercise. And so I'll release toxins, I'll get sick that night. That night I'll feel nauseous. Unless I do something to keep myself from getting nauseous. And that usually involves sugar. If I take in a lot of sugar, I can usually dissipate it. It's not so bad. Okay, the next chapter is a really fun chapter. It's about evolution and why we are the way we are. The evolution of the brain. Modern scientists see the study of the change of life over ages due to natural selection and sexual selection as beneficial to understanding humanity from more than just its current snapshot view. And of course, if we look at all the people around the world, the reality is all we're seeing is the way we look now. We can't project what we looked like 10,000 years ago. So we have scientists that look at humans and they try to determine what we looked like before. Or they will look at remnants of humans, the skulls and skeletons of humans, to try to see how we've changed over time. Because one of the things that we need to know is how we are going to change in the future. What's going to happen in the future. There are people that have estimated that the little finger is going to go away. If you look at my fingers, they're all just about the same length, as odd as that is. Other people have really long middle fingers, or short index fingers. Yeah, see, yours are like mine. Yeah, we've got short fingers. You got short fingers too? Yeah, okay, yeah. But there's some people with long fingers. Some people with short little fingers, and they assume that they are beyond where we are as far as evolution is concerned. So, but the reality is that when you type, and everybody's typing now, when you type, you need your little finger. Don't you need your little finger? Yeah, exactly. So I don't think the little finger is going to go away at all because we need it too much, right? Okay, but that's just about all we do with it is type. But we need to type with that finger. This can be done through DNA analysis, where scientists compare the DNA of one species with the DNA of another. So when we're talking about evolution, we can look at the chimpanzee is relatively close to us. As a matter of fact, their DNA is very close to ours. A huge percentage of their DNA is identical to ours. So therefore, they must have been part of our evolutionary past. For example, we know that the DNA of chimpanzees only differs from human DNA by 1.6%. As I said, it's a huge percentage. That means that 98.4% of their DNA is the same as ours, is identical to ours. So why can't we reproduce with chimpanzees? We don't have the same number of chromosomes. So we would have to select an animal that had exactly the same number of chromosomes. Otherwise, there's a flaw. I think we've got 46, and they have 48 or 52 or something. They're different from us, so we can't reproduce with them. Percentage of difference, we've got the common chimpanzee, the pygmy chimpanzee, then we have humans, and of course the gorilla and the chimpanzee have a very similar DNA to ours. But we can look at other primates, and they're way down the evolutionary scale from us. The lemur, for example. Oh, I'm sorry, old world monkey. Where's the lemur? They don't have the lemur. Lemur's actually farther away than the old world monkey. What's the difference between monkeys in the old world and monkeys in the new world? What's the difference between monkeys in Africa and monkeys in South America? Tails, exactly. The South American monkeys have prehensile tails. They have a tail that they use as an appendage. So they can actually hang by their tail. A monkey in Africa can't. Their tail is just for balance. It's not for grabbing a hold of anything. Scientists had been toying with the idea of evolution for a couple of centuries before Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace published their findings in 1858. It was a race to see which one would publish first. Darwin, of course, went on a trip to the Galapagos Islands, and from what he discovered at the Galapagos Islands, he created this theory of evolution. Now the strange thing was that Alfred Russel Wallace was putting together his theory of evolution at the same time. Now the interesting thing is they came up with exactly the same results, but Darwin published first. And he only published like 6 months before Russell did, or Wallace did. But he published first. There was nothing in Darwin that wasn't in Wallace. There wasn't anything in Wallace that wasn't in Darwin. So why do we give Darwin all the credit? That doesn't matter. I don't know. These usually this has to do with who you like and who you don't like. Darwin looked more like us. One of the reasons that Darwin was more popular than Wallace was because Darwin was also more religious than Wallace was. And because of that, he put more religious stuff in there. He made it seem, he tried to placate the religious people. And because he did that, of course, people would read Darwin over Wallace every day. Yeah. Anyway, they've been both working on it for about 30 years when both of them came out. 1959, Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Darwin made 3 main observations. Individuals of a given species are not identical. So I don't look the same as you. We're not identical. Some of the variation is inheritable. Most of the reason that I don't look like you is because I inherited it from my parents. Not all offspring will survive. Some offspring do not survive because they don't have the right genetic structure, and that happens. If you've ever had a litter of puppies, the puppy that usually doesn't survive is the smallest one, the one that didn't get enough nutrition in the womb, usually, and that is usually the one the mother won't feed. It's the last one to get food, so that one will usually starve to death. It won't develop the same. It won't grow as fast as the other puppies. It will be the runt. We used to see this all the time in pigs. If you've ever raised pigs, pigs will have a huge litter. They'll have 15, 20 piglets, and like half of them will survive. They don't have enough teats, for one thing, to feed all the piglets, and they'll all fight for food. But only the strongest will eat enough. It's not like the biggest piglet will become satiated and then it will leave and allow the other one to have the teat. That's not the way it works. They'll go to sleep on that teat so that they will get food. It's the survival of the fittest. In this case, it's survival of the fittest. It's very obvious when you're dealing with pigs. I can remember, we didn't raise pigs, but my neighbor did. And he would have hog houses. And he would go in there and he'd pull out all the dead piglets. Some of them were dead because the mother had crushed them when she laid down on them. And some of them were dead because they'd starved to death. But the ones that survived became really nice big pigs. Now the reality was that you could take one of those tiny little runt of a piglet and you could raise them, you could feed them yourself, they wouldn't turn out the same. They wouldn't be as big as the other pigs. So it was really survival of the fittest. And the ones that weren't meant to survive, the ones that didn't get enough food in the womb, would starve to death. That's just the way it worked. And we see the same thing in puppies. Of course, some of us, we feel sorry for the runts. Maybe I'm a runt, you know? Maybe that's why my mother didn't treat me very nice. Maybe that's why she called me little shit. But because I was the runt of the family. And the reality is, I've got a picture of me, my brothers, all my brothers and me in our military uniforms. We're all in the military at the same time. And I'm the shortest one. Maybe I really was the runt. Maybe I shouldn't have survived. My mother and father, when we would sit at the table, there were 8 of us, and they put me in between my mother and my father because I was the one that misbehaved the most. So maybe I wasn't supposed to survive. Darwin would later add a 4th corollary, that of sexual selection. Sexual selection states that each sex exerts selective pressures on the other in terms of both anatomical and behavioral features that favor reproductive success. Hence the strange anatomical features of some creatures. But most of these creatures are male. You can see a cardinal from almost a mile away. They're red. There's nothing out there that's red like that. The female is brown. She is camouflage. But the male is red. The redder they are, the more likely that they're going to reproduce. Because she's after the red stuff. She's going hotsy-totsy. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And it's the same way with peacocks. The larger the peacock tail, which makes them almost non-functional, the larger the peacock tail, the more likely that the peahen will want to have reproduce with the peacock. As odd as that seems. It seems like it's reproductively or survivally, this individual should not exist. The same way with the mandrill monkey. It's actually a great ape, the mandrill. As you can see, look at the coloring on this guy. And you can see him from miles away, and you know exactly what it is. So as humans, do we have sexual selection as well? What are we looking for? Big noses? Nice hair? There we go. Do humans participate in sexual selection? They used to refer to them as Ubangis. I don't. Babilla, they call them Babilla in this picture. Anyway, they put plates in their lips. The bigger the plate, the more attractive the woman, the more likely she's going to have lots and lots of children. No plate, no babies, baby. That's the way it works.
And her mouth?
That's her mouth, yeah. It's her upper lip.
Upper lip?
That's her upper lip. Okay. We do it to attract a mate.
Even at that age, they're
Yeah.
young.
The Chinese like women with small feet. It's just the Chinese. If you go to Japan, they don't care about the size of your feet. The Japanese they look at the size of your mouth, as odd as that seems. But the Chinese used to bind their feet. They used to take the little girl's feet and they'd wrap them and they would turn the toes underneath, and they would make their feet tiny. And then they'd have to walk like this. And they claimed that the reason they did it was so that it would protect their virginity. Because if they took wide, long strides like this, then it might break their hymen, and therefore they wouldn't seem to be a virgin anymore. As odd as that seems, the Chinese, they don't do this anymore, of course. But if you are around Asians, they have little tiny feet. I went to Korea, I was looking for soccer shoes. I wear a pretty big shoe, but the Koreans are little guys like I am. But they had like, the biggest shoe they had was like an 8. And they thought that was massive. And I wear an 11. Or at the time I wore an 11, 11 and a half. I wear a 12 and a half now. Oh my God, they won't even let me in the country. My feet are too big. I couldn't find any shoes. I went all over Korea. I finally found a little shop in Seoul that had shoes that they had made for an American guy, for a guy that was like 6'4", and they were the only shoes I could find. And they were size 11 and a half, I think. Anyway, they fit. But they were the only shoes in the whole country that fit me. As weird as that is. We'll pick this up more next time. Some of the strange things that American Indians used to do to make themselves, more attractive.